Now we've had a fun morning here that we'll detail in another video. But it's fun because it's our first sit on a new property, at least my first sit. Diane sat once and Dante sat once. And we're sitting over a scrape. And you might notice that in a lot of our videos, we have our mock scrapes, mock vine scrapes. And I've written about those and created videos on them for years. And I do it because it works. And you'll probably notice too, the majority of our buck pictures and videos that we get on our scrapes over time are actually during the daylight. So when it comes to hunting scrapes and hunting scrapes or hunting mock scrapes, perennial scrapes, there's some rules that I've come to live by when it comes to hunting scrapes and hunting over scrapes. And one, creating that daylight movement around scrapes. Of course, you have to have daylight movement in order to hunt over scrapes. Now, I know there's a lot of research out there that shows that traditionally a lot of scrape activities at night. And I think that's true for field edges, open areas, fence rows, and then certainly property that is poorly managed for hunter access and property that is overpressured, hunting pressure. So a lot of times research will show, research where, and I can think of one in particular, it was an article, I won't even name the magazine or who it was, but it was a 500-acre tract, and they on that piece of land, they professionally managed it, timber rotations, but they hunted out of box blinds for food plots. And I would just guess that they put a lot of hunting pressure on, and they found that the vast majority of their daylight activity was very minimal. And the vast majority of the scraping activity was after dark. Well, they had hunting pressure. They had a lot of habitat improvements that didn't line up. I believe they probably hunted very invasively, and so for that, even on 500 acres, it's pretty easy to turn a 500-acre chunk into a nocturnal parcel pretty quick. So making sure that your scrapes are daylight scrapes, limiting the hunting pressure, obviously. How you place your camera around that scrape, it has to be hidden. We have a hidden one right down behind me, down below, that works out really well. And then do your habitat management practices on your small parcel really line up. If they don't line up, then you're going to run into those movements. They're going to be random deer movements on your land. The less defined your movements are, the more random your improvements are, then the more you're going to run into deer, apply pressure, and you're going to lose the daylight movement around your scrapes. So number one, it has to be daylight before you even want to or choose to hunt a scrape. Just because it's an active scrape, it might be completely nocturnal. And so you're setting up on this big, beautiful scrape that has a lot of activity, but if you're finding that it's nocturnal, I wouldn't choose to hunt it. And so there are ways to make sure that they're daylight. The majority of the scrapes on our parcels, the small parcels that I hunt on and manage, are daylight, and there's a reason why. Now, two, that brings up a good point. It's got to be a part of a movement. The scrape itself is not the attraction. The scrape itself is not enough to throw a stand over. What other story does that scrape tell? For example, the scrape over my right shoulder right here is at the end of a long food plot. There's a water hole about 50 yards behind it, and then there's another food plot, a small hunting plot, about 50 yards past that. And then we also have an access that goes over my left shoulder that goes onto an adjoining property in thick cover. So we're in an X of movement. We're between small daylight food plots that are true hunting plots because we have thousands of acres of ag located around us. And we're in a position, we're in a bench system on this property, this 25-acre property that's between bottomlands and swamp up near Buffalo County, Wisconsin, and the bluffs. So we're kind of in between. So these deer aren't coming onto the land until an hour after light, and our trail cams are showing that. But they're a part of a movement, obviously between food and food, between food, water, and food. We have another mock scrape on the other food source. I have Dylan's in the stand filming right now, and he's looking behind my shoulder because that's where the last buck just came from, and we were actually getting prepared to shoot this scrape video, and we had a young buck, I think he was a 5-point, walk right under the scrape. He didn't work the scrape, he looked at it, but he walked right by. And so I'm watching where we saw a 3-year-old 8-point come from this morning, which is over off to my right a little bit. and Dylan's watching this way, so we have some wind cover, which is a good thing. But regardless, has to be a movement, and so we've had bucks come from both directions on this land already this morning, and pretty exciting, especially with the first sit on the land. So again, has to be daylight, and then it has to be a part of a movement. You know, in the old days, they would say that the bucks, and I grew up with this in the 80s and 90s, that a mature buck would travel downwind of a scrape during the day. Well, I think a lot of times, if he's traveling through an area with a scrape in heavily pressured area, he might be on that downwind thick edge. But if you take the nocturnal out of the movement of the land and you place that scrape right in the middle of the movement, then those deer will hit it right when they're traveling through. They won't go on the downwind edge. They'll just go right through the scrape. The scrape becomes the funnel of movement for that particular area. Now, when hunting a scrape, and I think this is the same as with a camera too, you know, I added that mock scrape over my right shoulder and down below me, and both those bucks visited today. I added that on Monday. It's Thursday morning right now. I added them on Monday afternoon right before a thunderstorm. Then I put a camera on it. So this was a scrape where the deer weren't coming in, used every little stick and leaf and nook and cranny all the way around that scrape. It was already active deer coming in. Instead, I went into an area that was in the trail of movement, deer walking through there, but they're not stopping and checking everything out alongside that scrape. So I added that scrape, added a camera, very, very safe time to do that. And you can extend that when it comes to hunting scrapes. I think sometimes the worst thing you could do, I don't think it's any different when you see a fresh scrape open up. You go in and throw a camera on it. You get one really good picture of a monster, and then you don't get him again because he picked you up when he went in there. He picked up the camera, he picked up the scent from putting in there. Again, that scrape is a focal point, whether it's at night or during the day. You add that camera to it, they see that box, you add it, you know, you're not careful putting that there. You know, I always have a rule, put the camera 6 feet in the air, put it on a tree that's wider than the camera, and make sure the profile's hidden. And that works. I think you can get away with a lower setup on a trail camera, not 6 feet, if it's covered from the sides really well and it has a good backdrop. So there's some rules to live by when it comes to placing a camera on a scrape that's already being used. Unless you can really hide that camera and your activities to do that, I wouldn't do it. And you can extend that to actually hunting out of a tree. And so you see this monster scrape pop up. And such a temptation, and I've done this in the past. I think I can remember back in 1986 standing on a branch on a big social scrape area that was about 5-6 feet wide, and we didn't have tree stands back then. We climbed up a tree with our bow, slung it over our shoulder, and stood on a branch. And it's amazing we lived with all the things we did growing up, but probably the worst thing I could have done. And a lot of times I do see that bucks come into a scrape with their eyes open. They're looking around for other bucks. They're territorial. And you know, you're standing on a branch right on top of the scrape or adding a new tree stand to the mix, installing that stand, you know, and even extending that to cutting limbs off and clearing shooting lanes. Not going to make that scrape a daylight scrape by doing that. So I like scrapes that are pre-hung and already there. And great time during the season, if you can get away with it, to put a mock scrape out, put a camera on it, and maybe even put a tree stand. These tree stands this tree stand's been here since July or June or August, whenever it was. So they've been here for a little while. The deer are used to them, any of the smells associated with them. And so really be wary of not only putting a trail camera on a scrape that's fresh during the season, but then slapping a stand right on top of it that the deer aren't used to at that point. Now, number 4, it's crazy because right now people are talking about, you know, how to hunt scrapes, how to go in and hunt scrapes, and as if the deer are only using them this time of the year during the rut. And what I find, if you have a good quality mock scrape's a lot different than a perennial looking branch, because if you have a hanging vine scrape or a hanging branch, I suggest whether you're using a vine or a branch, you find a branch that the deer readily rub in the area. For example, that might include jack pine up north, various oak species. So you pick what they're rubbing in the area. Basswood, I use a stick that's 5 to 6 feet long, 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch in diameter, and I hang it at the bottom of it about waist high. During the season, you can get away with putting one of those out if it's in the movement, right in directly in the movement, and you're being careful with the scent you leave in the area. Once that's out, not a bad option to hunt it. But when you have your mock scrapes set up and you put them right in the middle of the trail, like the one behind me, then what you find is every doe, every fawn, every buck that goes by is going to investigate it in some way. A lot of the fawns leave their scent, does leave their preorbital gland scent, bucks do. So the accumulation of scent on that licking branch when it's hanging down right in their trail is way different than some of these field edge scrapes that we have even on this food plot, where they have to go out of their way to actually go over and investigate. I find that most does and fawns do not do that, but when you put it right in the trail, those bucks, mature bucks, you'll find will be using them all year long. We have great pictures of bucks that are using those trail cameras, not only in January, but also in June, July, August. A lot of times I open them up at that time if they're not being used, by just using a rake, using a stick, and then I just urinate into it. So urinate into that scrape, into that mock scrape, and a lot of times that's all it takes. I don't even have to pee in it again. I don't touch it the rest of the season. So when is it a great time to hunt a scrape? Should be any time of the year. If you've opened your mock scrapes up, if you're using mock scrapes, and you've established those in June and July, they'll be ready to go. And then at the same time, right now I stuck one out. It could have been early season September, could have been middle of October. Instead, I put it out on, I'd have to think of the date, but I think it was October 21st. And here we had a nice 3-year-old buck come into it today. That little one just went under it. And we're going to pull the trail camera, and I'm hoping there's some more footage on it too. So you should be able to hunt a well-established scrape, especially a mock scrape, all season long. And I do. I have at least, but not more. I guess I should say I don't have more than, but I have roughly one mock scrape for every tree stand. My mock scrapes are typically located within bow shot, almost all of them, of a tree stand location, and then I have a location for a camera. So I pick the tree out for the camera, pick a spot out for the mock scrape, and then I install it, and they're by my tree stands. So I hunt over scrapes all the time because it's a part of the movement, or I wouldn't be hunting there in the first place, and the scrape adds to it. I'm not hunting the scrape first. I'm hunting the scrape because it's already a part of the movement, and it's been established, and it's being used during the daylight. Now, one final thought. Lots of huge field edge scrapes or fence row scrapes, and it is so tempting, especially when you put a camera on it and you get these giant bucks coming in at night, and you watch that over and over again, and it's pretty tempting to go hang a stand on that. Bucks, I found, don't go out of their way to go to that field edge too much and make a scrape unless there's other factors at play, meaning a thick brushy funnel, maybe the top of a draw, a thick brushy funnel, and then that scrape's just right on the edge, right there within a little 15-yard pinch point of movement right at the top of the draw on a little bench system where that buck might come out during the daylight. But typically they're not coming out in the daylight on a big wide open field. This food plot right here might be a half acre, the other one's a quarter acre. That's it down here, and it's surrounded by timber. So when I'm hunting a scrape and when I'm sitting over a scrape, you can bet the majority of the time I'm in thick cover, I'm in transition daylight cover where they're moving from bedding area to bedding area. We're getting lots of video right here of deer not only using this during the daylight, using this movement, but they're hitting the scrapes when they do so. And boy, we've had an explosion of bucks we're going to talk about in another video over the last week to 10 days. But that's how I hunt a scrape. I don't hunt it unless I'm seeing daylight movement. I make sure that scrape's a part of the movement. I make sure that it's back in the timber. And I love the vine scrapes. I don't set a tree stand over it if it's a perennial scrape that just opened up, let alone put a camera on it. And I think you can have a great deal of success hunting scrapes if you consider those rules for hunting scrapes this season and beyond. And boy, if you have a really good solid mock scrapes, and I have a lot of content about creating, if you just look up mock vine scrape, creating mock scrapes, mock licking branch, vine licking branches, all my stuff will come up at the top, whether it's on Google or YouTube. So there's a lot of learning that you can do on that, but they're very effective. I happen to hunt them a lot because they're, like I said, they're a part of the movement. Hope you enjoy the strategy. And if you're hunting scrapes this fall, I think you can find a lot of success if you follow those 5 scrape hunting strategies.